Hi, everybody. It's Dennis Daly, welcoming you to All Week Theater. Every week I take a classic old-time radio episode, cut it up into 5 pieces, and present it for your convenient listening pleasure. Now, Part 3. In this week's series, Mr. Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons.
Mr. Burkett? Mr. Burkett?
That's Mrs. Lorraine now.
Oh, I didn't know anyone was with you.
Mrs. Lorraine, this gentleman is Mr. Keene, the famous investigator.
How do you do, Mr. Keene?
How do you do, Mrs. Lorraine? This is my partner, Mike Clancy.
Pleased to meet you.
I'm glad somebody called on you to solve this dreadful murder in my cottage, Mr. Keene.
I'm making the investigation in behalf of Mrs. Haynes, the murdered man's widow.
Oh, that poor woman. I understand how she must feel.
Mr. Burkett told me your own husband met his death here in much the same way.
A year ago, Mr. Keene. I suppose Mr. Burkett told you that the Mr. Haynes who rented this cottage and was murdered was a former employee of my husband's old firm, the Lorraine Import Company?
I couldn't have told Mr. Keene that, Mrs. Lorraine, because you didn't tell me. It's the first I ever heard of it.
Don't you remember, Mr. Burkett? I told you when you informed me of the murder, and you said it was a mere coincidence.
Mrs. Lorraine, with all respect, I think your memory is failing.
Mrs. Lorraine, I'd like to speak to you privately. Will you step into the hall with me?
Surely, Mr. Keene.
Mrs. Lorraine, it's very puzzling why Mr. Burkett failed to tell me the murdered man was a former employee of your husband's company.
Mr. Keene, I know I told him. My husband often spoke of a Mr. Haynes. He was a traveling salesman for the company.
Do you recall how long ago he was discharged from his job? Because he was crippled?
Because he was crippled? Why, no. But I scarcely could know. On my husband's death, his business was sold. The present owner is named Ambrose Carter, I believe.
Mr. Ambrose Carter. I'll scribble that name down.
From what I hear, Mr. Carter is quite a different man from what my husband was.
Mr. Burkett, the rental agent, says your deceased husband had a warm spot in his heart for anyone who was crippled, and that a number of cripples came here and he gave them money. Is that true?
Yes, Mr. Keene. My husband used this cottage as a sort of hideaway, but they found him, many on crutches.
Is it true that you commissioned Mr. Burkett to rent this cottage for the small sum of $25 a month?
Yes, Mr. Keene, and completely furnished. My husband was murdered here.
I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Lorraine.
Mr. Keene, about that poor Mrs. Haynes, whose husband was murdered here, too. Is she in good financial circumstances? I'd like to help her.
You're a good-hearted woman, Mrs. Lorraine.
I realize from tragic experience how she feels.
I hope to see you again. Mike, would you come here, please?
Sure, Mr. Keene.
I believe Mrs. Lorraine has given me the clue to solve the murder in this cottage.
She has?
We will now visit the present owner of the Lorraine Importing Company, Mr. Ambrose Carter.
Yes, Mr. Keene.
And on the way, I'll phone the police. It's possible Mr. Burkett, the real estate man, is connected with the murder.
Mr. Keene and his partner, Mike Clancy, are investigating the murder of Tom Haynes, a young salesman, crippled and on crutches, who was shot to death, seemingly without motive, in a charming white cottage he and his wife Jenny had just rented for the unbelievable sum of $25 a month. Mr. Keene has questioned Orville Burkett, rental agent, who was suspiciously near at the time of the murder. Also, the wealthy owner, Mrs. Lorraine, who offered the cottage at such low rent because her own husband was murdered there a year ago. Now Mr. Keene and Mike are approaching the office of the Lorraine Import Company, where the murdered Tom Haynes had worked, and which Mrs. Lorraine's husband had owned. He's come to see the new owner, Ambrose Carter, and we hear Mr. Keene saying,
Here's the Lorraine Import Company's office, Mike.
And the sign on the door says Ambrose Carter, President, Mr. Keene.
Do you gentlemen wish to see someone?
Yes, Mr. Ambrose Carter, if he's in.
I'm Ambrose Carter.
Well, my name is Keene, and this is Mike Clancy, my partner.
Mr. Keene, the private investigator?
I'm investigating the murder of Tom Haynes. I understand he was employed by you, Mr. Carter.
Tom Haynes worked here until 6 months ago. I'm surprised to hear he was murdered.
You hadn't heard, then?
No, Mr. Keene. Where was he murdered?
At Mrs. Lorraine's cottage, a few minutes after he had rented it.
Does that ring any bells for you, Mr. Carter?
None, Mr. Clancy. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I have no information for you.
So join me next time when I take a classic old-time radio episode and split it up into 5 easy-to-digest pieces, right here on All Week Theater.